This is the story of Alexander Melville. He was born in Pittenweem, Scotland. There he married a sweet young lass named Elizabeth Adamson. And together they wanted to start a new life. And after meeting the missionaries at the LDS Church, they moved to the United States to a town called Melville, Illinois. Even though they were poor, they had good hearts and they were in good cheer. They met a man named Joseph Smith. He was the prophet of this newfound religion. After being there a short time, he became a member of the Nauvoo Legion. And shortly after that, the prophet Joseph Smith was martyred at Carthage jail. Trouble began. The mob came and threatened their lives and threatened their property. But while they were in Nauvoo, they were able to do temple work for his mother's family. After Joseph Smith's death, they were trying to decide who the next prophet should be. Alexander was there when Brigham Young stood forth, and he spoke as if he was Joseph Smith, and everybody agreed that he should be the next prophet. Troubles continued. And in the spring of 1846, the saints prepared to leave Nauvoo. The majority of the saints did leave, but the ones that were least prepared, such as Alexander and his little wife, Elizabeth Adamson, they remained behind to help defend the town of Nauvoo and also to defend the temple. But after some small skirmishes with the mob, it was decided it'd be better to turn the town over to the mob and to leave. So in September of 1846, Elizabeth and Alexander and the little boy Joseph, who they had named after the Joseph Smith, left toward winter's quarters. They ferried across the river, and on the other side they had no provisions to continue. And they were starving, they were freezing. And a miracle happened. The quail came into camp. And the ones that were so weak were able to capture the quail in their hands. So because of this miracle, their lives were spared. They continued into winter quarters, and their little son Joseph passed away. So Alexander and his wife Elizabeth buried their little son on the prairie. When they got into winter quarters, Elizabeth was ill, and she too passed away, and she was buried in Cutler's Park, which is next to winter quarters. While there, Elizabeth Adamson and Alexander had a little daughter named Margaret, and he left her behind with a lady named Jane Ann Dutson, young teenager, and he was going to head back to St. Louis to help build barrels so he could raise money to head to Utah. I'll give you a little story about Jane Ann. Her mother was Anne Green. She was the wife of John Dutson, who had passed in a boating expedition. He was a map maker, and it was supposed that he drowned because they had never seen him again. The two of them had two children. One was Jane Ann Dutson, and the other was John William Dutson. Now, they lived in England, and Wilford Woodruff went to England teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he came across a congregation which was all prepared to accept the gospel. And Jane Ann and Anne and John William and Anne Green's parents and brothers and sisters were part of this group. Anne's brother wanted to be the first one to be baptized, and so he was, like 2 o'clock in the morning in the river. But he was also the first one to fall away from the gospel. Evidently, he was converted to being the first and not to the gospel. Anyway, Anne Green and her family, they all prepared to go to the United States. And eventually they made it to Nauvoo. While in Nauvoo, they became acquainted with the prophet Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith set Anne Green apart as a nurse midwife and told her that she should only use herbs to help heal people. And also while they was there, John went to work at a brick yard. And in pay, he was paid enough bricks to where he could build a house for him and his mother. Half the house belonged to the mother, and the other half belonged to him. So they set up home there. Anne Green married John Carling. John Carling helped design the font in the Nauvoo Temple. In the spring of 1846, when the mob came, they prepared and they left Nauvoo. The river at that time was frozen over. Even though it was breaking up, they were able to cross over to the other side. At that time, Jane Ann was taking care of some orphan children, which were the nephews and nieces of John Taylor's wife. Their last name was Cannon. She helped them go from one iceberg to another iceberg until they got safely across over to the other side. And just when they got to the other side, the Cannon's wagon broke through the ice and fell into the river. The poor Cannon children couldn't stand it any longer, and they broke down and cried. At first they lost their parents, now they have lost everything they owned in the world. But men on the other shore were able to throw ropes down into the river and catch hold of the wagon and safely pull it back up onto the shore, so all they had to do was let it dry out. Jane Ann and her mother, they continued into winter quarters, and this is where they met Alexander Melville, and they fell in love and they got married, and they decided to go to St. Louis to try to raise some money. And this is where Anne Green's parents died. A bad sickness came through the area, cholera. They'd make sheets during the day and bury the dead at night. Jane Ann and Alexander had a son named James, another one named John. And at this time, with the little girl Margaret, they decided it was time to head west. So the night that Alexander quit working at the barrel factory caught on fire and burnt to the ground. Also, the Nauvoo Temple caught on fire and it burnt, and the only thing left standing was the rock wall, which was later knocked down by a tornado. They made their way into Wyoming and into Utah. They settled in Provo for a while. They had to sell all their clothing just to buy food. And eventually they were able to settle down into a little town called Fillmore. Also at that time, he was called on a mission to help discover a new place to build a new town. Brigham Young called him on a mission to go toward the desert, and they found the place where the town of Deseret was to be built. And also at that time, Captain Gunnison and his troops were massacred by a group of Indians, and they had to go there for a recovery mission and haul the bodies of Captain Gunnison and the sergeant back to town. The other soldiers were just buried at the site where this happened. He also helped with the construction of the Territory State House. And in the State House today is his ox yoke and some of the barrels he made back when he was a cooper in the shipping business. Later on, he became a bishop, and it was his duty to give back all the property back to the original owners. But there was a few people there that said they had more than they really did. And Alexander took his turn last. And so even though he had worked hard to gain land, you know, so he ended up with hardly any of his property left over. And his sons took it upon themselves to hold this against the church, even though the church had nothing to do with it. It was just the way humanity was. I believe it still is today. So anyway, they fell away from the church at that time. Alexander and Jane raised a big family of 10 children, plus Margaret, which was the daughter of Anne Elizabeth Adamson. In 1877 and 1880, Alexander took his family to the St. George Temple, and they did temple work for their ancestors while they were there. And he hid these records in the attic of his house, and his granddaughter found these records. When he died, he had some sores on his hands and things, so his children were scared that they might catch this sickness that he had. So they burned everything that he had. But miraculously, these records survived, and we have them today, which is really quite a neat find. I have attached one of these records to this video. This is just an introduction of this great family. I hope when you're on your own that you can go ahead and research it yourself. I have just briefly gone over these people to kind of give you an idea of what they went through and how great they were. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed. We'll talk to you later. Bye.